Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. Mike Stevens felt it in the pit of his stomach before the sound even reached his ears. The rumble in the distance was too distinct to ignore, a low growl that seemed to vibrate the air itself. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. His breath caught in his throat. Something was coming, and it wasn't just the usual quiet hum of the small town's morning routine. The sound grew louder, more intense, until it filled the space around him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shudder with each passing second. There was no mistaking it now. Military trucks. He stood frozen in his small grocery store's doorway, staring down the empty street. The morning sun cast long shadows on the pavement, and for a moment it almost seemed like a regular day. But Mike knew better. His heart beat faster, and his legs felt heavy. It was as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on him. It had started as a simple gesture. A veteran, a family, groceries. It was supposed to be a small thing, a way to give back. But now, standing at the threshold of his store, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A shiver ran down his spine. He turned, back into the store, his eyes landing on the shelves stacked high with goods, items he could barely afford to stock. But still, he'd always made sure there was food for everyone who walked through his door. He didn't know why Paul Rivers had come to his store that morning. Maybe it was the flyer he'd put up on the bulletin board last week, offering free groceries to veterans and their families. Maybe it was just the look in Paul's eyes when he walked in, tired, old, yet still proud. Mike had only known Paul through the occasional chats they'd had over the years. Small talk about the weather, a little about his service, a little about life in general. But today was different. Paul had come in with his daughter, Emily, and his granddaughter, Lily, in tow. The small, frail old man had looked up at Mike from beneath the weight of years of hardship. His hands were weathered, his clothes simple, yet his eyes held something that made Mike feel like he was looking at a man who had seen more than his fair share of struggles. A man who had given so much to his country, yet had little to show for it. "I saw your flyer, Mike," Paul had said, his voice rough but steady. "My family could use a little help." It wasn't uncommon for veterans to struggle, Mike thought. But Paul's family had nothing but good things to say about him. They had lived in the same neighborhood for years, and everyone in town knew that Paul had always given more than he received. There was something in the way Paul had asked, though, that hit Mike in the chest, something that felt more like a plea than a request. So Mike did what he could. He gathered a small basket for them, bread, canned beans, milk, and a few other things he knew they could use. It wasn't much, but it would help. He gave it to them for free, no questions asked. Just a simple, kind gesture. "I can't thank you enough, Mike," Paul had said, his voice breaking slightly. He looked over at his daughter and granddaughter, a weary smile on his face. But as they left, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the look in Paul's eyes, it was something else, a quiet sense of unease that lingered long after they had walked out the door. Now, as Mike stood in the doorway, staring down the street at the approaching military trucks, he felt that unease spread through his body like wildfire. The trucks were moving fast, roaring like beasts on the hunt. His stomach clenched. He didn't know why they were coming, but he had a gut feeling that it had something to do with Paul and the small favor he'd done that morning. The rumble of the trucks grew louder, and Mike's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door slamming open behind him. Jenny, his assistant, rushed into the store, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Mike!" she started, her voice trembling. "Mike, you need to see this." Mike turned to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's going on?" he demanded. Jenny's breath came in short bursts, as if she couldn't catch it fast enough. She motioned toward the window, and Mike's eyes followed her gaze. Outside, the street was no longer empty. Military vehicles had surrounded the block. Several trucks had parked along the side of the road, blocking the exits. Soldiers in full gear were unloading from the trucks, walking with deliberate steps toward the town's main square. Mike could see the unmistakable glint of their rifles in the morning sun. The sight was jarring. Mike had never seen the military in his small town. Not like this. There had been occasional visits, recruitment drives, parades, and the like. But this was different. This was an invasion, and it felt personal. Jenny... Mike's voice cracked. What the hell is going on? I don't know, Mike, but there's something you need to see. It's on the news. She grabbed his arm and tugged him toward the back of the store where the television was. The screen flickered to life, and Mike's breath caught in his throat. The image was clear, an aerial view of the town. The newscaster's voice came through the speakers, calm and authoritative, but the words sent a chill down Mike's spine. Military presence confirmed in the small town of Riverton. Following a series of unconfirmed reports regarding a local veteran and his family. Authorities have not released further details, but are urging residents to remain calm. A number of military trucks have been dispatched, and the area is currently under lockdown. Local law enforcement is assisting. The image on the screen switched to a shot of Paul's house. Mike could see the front yard, the old mailbox, the swing hanging in the tree. Everything looked normal. But then, in the distance, he saw the military trucks parked along the road. They were at Paul's house, too. They were everywhere. Paul, Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. What did he get himself into? Jenny looked at him, her face pale. What do we do now? Mike didn't know. He didn't know anything anymore. The image of Paul's face as he'd left the store earlier that morning was still fresh in his mind. Had he known something? Had he been involved in something that Mike didn't understand? The trucks were closing in now. The soldiers were moving, if fast, their boots pounding against the pavement as they set up a perimeter around the town. Mike felt trapped in his own store, like a fly caught in a spider's web. There was no way out. No escape. Mike Stevens? The voice came from outside, loud and clear, cutting through the tension. A soldier stood at the door, his uniform sharp and pressed, his expression stone cold. Mike's breath caught in his throat. Yeah, that's me, he managed to say, his voice hoarse. Step outside, the soldier ordered. You're coming. With us? Mike froze. What was going on? Why did they want him? He had done nothing wrong. He had simply given a man some groceries. Jenny grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. Mike, don't do it. You don't know what's going on. You don't... But Mike was already moving. His feet were heavy, his mind spinning, but his body took him forward. He stepped out of the store and into the morning air, where the weight of the situation pressed down on him. As he walked toward the truck, he glanced back one last time at his store. He saw the figure of Paul standing at the edge of the street, watching him. Their eyes met for a split second, and Mike felt a cold chill run through his veins. There was something in Paul's gaze, something that said it was too late to turn. Back now. The truck door slammed shut behind him, and the engine roared to life. As the vehicle rumbled away, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. Mike Stevens felt the vibrations of the truck's engine pulse through his body, each bump in the road sending a jolt of anxiety straight into his chest. The military vehicle sped through the streets, its tires thundering against the uneven pavement. Outside the small, barred window of the truck, the world rushed by in a blur. Familiar places now looking strange, almost surreal, under the heavy shadow of military presence. His head spun with questions, none of which seemed to have an answer. What had happened? How had a simple favor, a small act of kindness, escalated into something this dangerous? He glanced toward the soldier sitting next to him. The man's eyes were fixed forward, cold and distant. Mike wanted to ask him everything. Why they were here, what had happened to Paul, why they had come for him. But the words stuck in his throat. He had been taken without warning, without any explanation, and now the silence inside the truck was suffocating. Jenny, who had grabbed his arm just before he stepped out of the store, had watched him leave with fear etched on her face. He had wanted to say something to reassure her, but the words had escaped him, as if they were trapped inside his chest. Just like the fear that had grown with every passing second, the truck rolled to a stop. Mike felt a sudden jolt as the engine cut off, and the soldiers in the back of the vehicle began to move. Mike was still trying to make sense of everything when the door was yanked open. A soldier motioned for him to step out. He hesitated, his body frozen, not sure if he should take that first step. He had never been in a situation like this before. The air outside felt thick, heavy with the weight of uncertainty. But there was no choice. He stepped down from the truck and into the military compound. The base was a stark contrast to the small town he had known his whole life. A few military trucks were parked in neat rows, soldiers milling about checking their equipment. The distant hum of helicopters filled the air. The place was clean, efficient, and yet everything about it made Mike's skin crawl. He had never seen the military in his town like this, and the presence of it here felt wrong, like a foreign force occupying a place it didn't belong. "Mike Stevens," a deep voice called from the other side of the compound. Mike turned to see a tall officer approaching, his uniform sharp, his expression unreadable. He had the kind of presence that demanded respect, and it was clear that he wasn't here to waste time. The officer stopped a few feet away from Mike, his eyes scanning him carefully, as if weighing him against some unseen scale. "Follow me," the officer said. Turning and striding toward a nearby building, Mike followed him, his feet dragging. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew this wasn't going to be easy. The building they entered was large and utilitarian, with walls that seemed to hum with cold energy. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting an unflattering glow over the scene. The air smelled sterile, like metal and rubber, but beneath that, Mike could smell something else, something sharp, a kind of tension that gripped everything in the room. The officer led him down a narrow hallway, pausing in front of a door that led into a small, dimly lit room. There was a table in the center, several chairs around it, and a single flickering monitor on one of the walls. The officer gestured for Mike to sit down at the table. "Sit," he said, his voice cold and commanding. Mike did as he was told, his heart pounding in his chest. His palms were slick with sweat, his mind still racing. What was going on? Why? Had the military come? And what did they want from him? The officer took a seat across from him, leaning forward slightly. His eyes were sharp, like a predator sizing up its prey. There was something about him, something unsettling in the way he looked at Mike, as if Mike was a piece of a puzzle he had yet to solve. "You gave food to a veteran this morning," the officer said, his voice low. "Paul Rivers. Why?" Mike blinked, startled by the question. "What? I just gave him some groceries. I do it for veterans sometimes. He needed help." The officer didn't respond immediately, his gaze never leaving Mike's face. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Mike could feel the weight of the officer's stare pressing into him, trying to read every inch of his face. It was like being under a microscope. Each flicker of his eyes felt like it was being analyzed, dissected. "You gave him food for free," the officer repeated, as though the idea of it were somehow unnatural. "Why?" Mike swallowed hard. "Because he's a veteran, because he's been through things. He served this country, and if I can do something small to help him, I will." The officer leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. There was something in his eyes now, something almost calculating, as if he had just heard what he wanted to hear. "You don't know who Paul Rivers really is, do you?" the officer said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement, as if he were enjoying Mike's confusion. Mike frowned. "What do you mean?" The officer smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, predatory. "Paul Rivers is a man of interest. A key player in something much bigger than you think. His involvement goes far beyond what you're aware of. He's not just a veteran. He's part of something much darker. Mike's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? You don't understand. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached over and pressed a button on the monitor behind him. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage of a man. The same man Mike had seen earlier, standing outside his store that morning. Paul Rivers. But now, the footage showed something different. Paul wasn't standing in front of a small grocery store. He was meeting with people, shadowy figures in dark rooms, discussing things that Mike couldn't quite make out. The video was short, but it was enough to make Mike's stomach turn. Paul involved in something darker. Mike couldn't wrap his mind around it. This couldn't be the same man who had smiled kindly at him, who had seemed so grateful for the small act of kindness. Do you understand now? The officer asked, leaning forward again. Your small act of charity just set off a chain reaction that you can't undo. Paul Rivers isn't just a man asking for help. He's a person involved in an operation that puts your entire town in a danger. Mike's mind raced. I don't believe you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You're saying he's some kind of criminal? That he's dangerous? The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured to the video. Again, the grainy footage shifted, and this time there were images of military equipment, heavily armed men, secretive meetings, coded messages. And then Mike saw something that made his heart drop into his stomach. Paul, standing with one of the soldiers Mike had seen earlier, shaking hands as if sealing a deal. I'm telling you, Stevens, the officer said, his tone hardening. Paul Rivers is connected to an underground network. They're operating right under your nose, and you just handed them the key to everything. Mike's world felt like it was spinning. What was happening? How had he gotten caught up in something this massive? He had never asked for any of this. All he had done was offer a bit of food to a man who looked like he needed it. Now, the officer continued, you're going to help us. You're going to cooperate. You'll give us everything you know about Paul Rivers, about his family, and if you do, we might let you go. But if you don't... The officer's voice trailed off, and Mike felt the weight of his words settle over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Mike opened his mouth to protest, to say something, anything, but his mind was too full, too overwhelmed. He was stuck in something he didn't understand, caught between the walls of a world he never thought he'd enter. Let's talk, the officer said softly, almost as if he were enjoying the tension. Tell me everything you know. But Mike didn't know anything, and suddenly he wished he hadn't opened the door to Paul Rivers that morning. He wished he hadn't given away that basket of food. Because now the man who had once been a simple, grateful veteran was a piece in a much bigger game, and Mike was stuck in the middle of it, with no way out. Mike Stevens felt like his heart had been ripped out of his chest, a suffocating weight pressing down on him. The room, stark and sterile, seemed to close in around him, the walls pulsing with the sound of his own racing heartbeat. The officer's eyes were still fixed on him, waiting for a response, a sign that Mike would crack, that he'd spill everything he knew about Paul Rivers. But Mike didn't know anything. He had simply given a man some food. A veteran, a man who had sacrificed so much for this country, and all Mike had done was offer him a small act of kindness. Now, everything had spiraled out of control, and Mike was stuck in the middle of something much larger than he could comprehend. The officer, still silent, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern against the cold surface of the table. His gaze never wavered, and Mike could feel the weight of it, like a pressure building inside him, making it harder to breathe. The room seemed to grow smaller with each passing second, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like the constant hum of a warning bell. Mike swallowed, trying to gather his thoughts, to make sense of everything that had happened since that morning. He had never been involved in anything like this before. Hell, he had never even considered that his small-town grocery store would become a pawn in some larger game. He was just a man trying to make a living, trying to help people. Now, he was caught up in a web of deceit, danger, and lies, and he had no idea how to get out. "What do you want from me?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse, his throat dry. The officer's lips curled into a thin smile. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of someone who held all the power, someone who had the upper hand and knew it. "We want you to help us," the officer said calmly, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "You'll give us everything. You know about Paul Rivers, his movements, his connections, his relationships, everything." Mike shook his head in disbelief. "I told you I don't know anything. I don't know what Paul's done or what he's involved in. He's just a veteran. I gave him some groceries, for God's sake." The officer's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Mike saw something shift behind them. Something dangerous. "We know you're lying, Stevens. We have evidence that ties Paul Rivers to a network of individuals who've been operating under the radar for years. And we know that you're more involved in this than you realize. Every action you take, no matter how small, has consequences." Mike felt his hands clench into fists, his nails digging into his palms as the weight of the officer's words settled over him. He was being dragged into something he had no part in. He was being used, manipulated. And for what? For a small act of kindness that had turned into a nightmare, the officer continued, his voice steady and cold. "You've already made the mistake of getting involved, Stevens. Now you have two choices. You can help us, tell us everything you know, and we'll let you go. Or you can refuse, and we'll make sure you understand the consequences of that decision." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating like a storm cloud ready to burst. Mike felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead, his mind racing, his thoughts spinning in a frenzy. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know who to trust. All he wanted was to go home to find some kind of peace again. But now, that seemed impossible. "You're not hearing me, Stevens," the officer said, his voice softening but with an undercurrent of menace. "You can't just walk away from this. You've already crossed a line. You're already involved, whether you like it or not. Now, the question is, how far are you willing to go to protect yourself?" Mike's thoughts were a whirlwind. How far would he go to protect himself? The question echoed in his mind like a cruel joke. He had never been a violent man. He had never been the type to back down from a fight, but he had never found himself in a situation like this. He had never imagined that something as simple as offering a man food could lead him to this point. And then there was Paul, the man he had helped, a man who had seemed so grateful, so ordinary, just trying to make ends meet. What had he gotten involved in? What was he mixed up in that had brought the military down on his small town? The officer's voice brought Mike back to the present. "We've been watching Paul for some time now. He's been meeting with individuals we suspect are connected to illegal activities, smuggling, arms dealing, espionage. It's all part of a much larger operation that has been unfolding for years. And you, Mike Stevens, have become a key player in that operation, whether you realize it or not." Mike's stomach churned. He couldn't believe it. Paul, involved in something like that? It didn't make sense. He had known the man for years. He had always been kind, had always talked about his time in the service, about his love for his family. How could someone like Paul be mixed up in something so dangerous? "Why me?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you asking me? For help? I don't know anything about this." The officer leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Mike's. "You're not as innocent as you think, Stevens. We know you've been in contact with Paul, and we know that you've seen things you shouldn't have. You've helped him without even realizing the consequences of your actions, and now we need you to help us take him down." Mike recoiled, his mind reeling. He wanted to deny everything. He wanted to tell the officer to go to hell, to walk out of this room and never look back. But something in the officer's gaze, something in the cold determination of his posture, told Mike that walking away wasn't an option. "Tell us what you know," the officer repeated, his voice now dangerously low, "and we'll let you go." Mike's mind was racing. He couldn't think clearly. He couldn't make sense of any of this. He had to get out. He had to find a way out of this mess before it was too late. But before he could respond, the door to the room burst open, and 2 more soldiers entered. Their eyes scanned the room quickly, their expressions hard. "Sir," one of them said, his voice clipped, "we've got a situation." The officer stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He shot Mike one last look before turning to the soldiers. "What is it?" "Paul Rivers," the soldier said, his voice tight with urgency. "He's gone. We lost track of him." Mike felt his heart skip a beat. "What do you mean he's gone? Where did he go?" The soldier didn't respond immediately, but the tension in the room was palpable. The officer's jaw clenched, his face a mask of frustration. "He's disappeared," the soldier said, his voice low. "We had eyes on him, but somehow he slipped through. We don't know how, but we're tracking him now. We'll find him." The officer took a deep breath, his fists tightening. "Find him," he growled. "Now!" The soldiers nodded and left, leaving Mike alone in the room with the officer. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and for the first time, Mike felt something shift in the air, a sudden awareness that things were spiraling out of control. He had been caught in something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. "Mike Stevens," the officer said, his voice cold, "you've just become a part of something much darker than you realize, and now you're going to help us finish it." Mike's stomach turned. He felt trapped, like a rat in a cage. He wanted to fight, to escape, but he knew there was nowhere to run. Mike Stevens had never felt so powerless in his life. He was trapped in the cold, sterile room, a victim of his own good intentions. He had tried to do the right thing, to help. A man who had served his country, a man who seemed to be nothing more than a humble, struggling veteran. Now, Mike was caught in a web of deceit, forced into a role he had never chosen, and all because of one small act of kindness. The officer was still standing in front of him, his eyes piercing into Mike, as though he were waiting for a confession. But Mike had nothing to confess. He had given Paul Rivers some food, nothing more, yet somehow that simple gesture had led him here, into a world he couldn't understand. The officer's words echoed in Mike's mind. "You've become a part of something much darker than you realize." And it was true. Everything had changed the moment Paul had walked into his store that morning. The military trucks, the soldiers, the secrecy. It was all too much. Mike couldn't believe how quickly his life had spiraled out of control. But now, the officer's latest revelation hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. Paul Rivers was missing. The words reverberated in Mike's mind, the final piece of the puzzle slipping into place. If Paul was missing, if the military couldn't find him, then it meant something even worse was happening. Paul had been involved in something far bigger than Mike could have ever imagined, something dangerous, something that had now put both their lives at risk. The officer's voice snapped Mike back to the present. "We've lost Paul," the officer said, his tone sharp. "And I have a feeling he's not just running away from us. He's hiding something we need to find. And you're going to help us." Mike felt the weight of those words, like a heavy chain around his neck. He wanted to scream, to shout, to tell the officer that he wasn't part of this, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But the truth was, the more the officer talked, the more Mike realized there was no way out. He was trapped, and the only way out was to play along, to find Paul and uncover whatever it was that had plunged them both into this nightmare. The door to the room opened again, and another soldier entered, his face tight with anxiety. "Sir, we've located a possible hideout," the soldier said, his voice steady but urgent. "It's a warehouse outside of town. We've been tracking Paul's movements, and we think he's there." The officer stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Get me a team. We're going in." Mike's heart raced. This was it. They were going after Paul, and he had no idea what they would find. He had no idea what Paul had gotten himself into, but everything about this situation screamed danger. Whatever Paul was hiding, whatever had led the military to this point, Mike knew it was big. And if he didn't play along, if he didn't help them find Paul, the consequences would be far worse than anything he could imagine. "Mike Stevens," the officer said, turning to him, his eyes hard. "You're coming with us. We're going to find Paul, and we're going to make sure he's not a threat to national security. And you're going to help us do that. Understood?" Mike's stomach twisted. He didn't have a choice. There was no way out. He nodded silently, his mouth dry. The officer gestured for him to follow. The journey to the warehouse was a blur. The truck rattled over uneven roads, its engine a constant roar that seemed to echo in Mike's chest. The air outside was thick with tension, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The military convoy moved in tight formation, a show of force that made Mike feel smaller with each passing second. He had never been part of anything like this. He had never been this close to danger, this close to something so sinister. The warehouse appeared on the horizon, an imposing, hulking structure that seemed to loom over them like a dark fortress. The convoy pulled into the parking lot, and Mike felt a sudden chill crawl up his spine. This place felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The officer led the way, his team following close behind. Mike was ushered into the building, his heart pounding in his chest. The inside of the warehouse was just as eerie as the outside. Empty shelves lined the walls, and the overhead lights flickered ominously, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The air smelled stale, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Stay close," the officer instructed, his voice low and tense. "We don't know what we're walking into." Mike nodded, his breath shallow, his mind raced. What had Paul been doing here? What was he hiding? They moved through the warehouse cautiously, the tension thickening with every step. The soldiers scanned the area, their weapons at the ready, while Mike trailed behind, trying to make sense of everything. Every corner they turned, every door they opened seemed to lead them deeper into a maze of secrets that Mike didn't understand. But one thing was clear. Paul had been here, and he had left something behind. Something that would explain everything. They reached the back of the warehouse, and the officer motioned for the soldiers to spread out. Mike was too nervous to ask what was going on, too afraid to say anything at all. The truth was, he was terrified. He had no idea what they were going to find here, or what it meant for him. But he knew one thing for sure. He needed to know the truth. He needed to understand why Paul had been involved in all of this, and why it had dragged him into the chaos. "Over here!" one of the soldiers called out, his voice tense. He was standing by a large stack of crates, his flashlight trained on something on the ground. The officer moved quickly, his eyes scanning the area. When he reached the crates, he froze. Mike saw the look in his eyes, surprise, shock, maybe even fear. The officer motioned for Mike to come forward. "You need to see this." Mike approached cautiously, his heart in his throat. He looked down, and what he saw made his stomach drop. There on the floor beneath the crates was a small metal box, slightly open. Inside, there were papers, stacks of documents, each marked with a red stamp that Mike couldn't make out. But what really caught his attention was the small black book lying on top of the papers. The officer reached down and picked up the book. It was old, weathered, and bound in black leather. He opened it carefully, flipping through the pages, his face growing more and more serious with each page he turned. "What is it?" Mike asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What's in there?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned the book toward Mike, showing him the pages. They were filled with names, dozens of names, some crossed out, others circled, in red ink. Each name was followed by a date, a location, and a series of coded messages that Mike couldn't understand. "Do you recognize any of these names?" the officer asked. Mike scanned the pages, but none of the names seemed familiar. Then his eyes landed on one name near the bottom of the page, Paul Rivers. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the proof. Paul wasn't just a simple veteran struggling to survive. He was part of something much larger. He was involved in an operation that had ties to people, places, and events Mike couldn't even begin to comprehend. The officer turned to Mike, his expression hardening. "This is what Paul was hiding. This is what we've been tracking. This book, these names, they're part of a global network. A network that's been operating for years under the radar." Mike's mind was reeling. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had believed about Paul, about his small-town life, was a lie. Paul had been playing a part in something far bigger, far more dangerous than Mike could have imagined. "What happens now?" Mike asked, his voice shaky. The officer's gaze softened just slightly, as if he were finally seeing the man in front of him, not just a pawn in the game. "Now, we finish this," he said quietly, "and we make sure no one else gets hurt." Mike nodded, but the weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. He had helped uncover a part of the truth, but the questions still lingered. What happened to Paul? What was he involved in? And what would Mike's role be in all of this from now on? As the officer turned to leave, Mike looked at the book one last time. The names, the dates, the codes. It was all a reminder that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and in that moment Mike knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning.